Testing. Hello, everyone. This is Rabbi Ari Sachs coming to you with another edition of this week's online Parashah class. I'm so happy you could join us as we discuss a really interesting Torah portion, Parashat Vaetchanan, which is in the second Torah portion in the book of Deuteronomy. Sorry, one second. Apologize for that interruption. So the second Torah portion of the book of Deuteronomy, Parashat Vaetchanan, is full of lots of interesting things, particularly the Shema, which appears in chapter 6, and the Ten Commandments, which appears before in chapter 5. But what I actually want to talk about today is prior to both of these, in which Moses is speaking to the Israelites and kind of giving a basic introduction to what he's about to share. But before we even get to that, I want to just remind those who already know it and to share with those who do not of a very popular midrash, of a very popular legend that comes from the Talmud, from Masechet Shabbat, page 146a, in which Rav Yosef, one Talmud scholar, he says that there is a tradition in which all of Israel, everyone who eventually would live as to be part of the people of Israel, actually stood at Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments. Now, he doesn't say particularly that they all stood at Mount Sinai, but rather that their spirits, that a part of them was actually all there, even if their physical beings weren't there. And the verse he uses to prove that point actually stems from a verse later on in Deuteronomy, which I want to share with you in just a moment. Comes from chapter 29 of Deuteronomy, towards the beginning of a Torah portion known as Nitzavim, which means to gather, or to stand together. And I'll share that with you right now. So in this Torah portion, in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 13, V'lo itchem levadechem anochi koret et habrit hazot. Neither with you only do I make this covenant and oath, ve'et ha'ala azot, and this oath, but rather ki et asher yeshno po, but all those who do not stand here, imanu omed hayom, all those who are not here with us standing this day, lifnei Adonai Eloheinu, before the Lord our God, ve'et asher einenu po imanu hayom, and also with him that is not here with us this day. So, meaning that all those people who are standing here this day and all those people who are not standing here this day are to be part of this covenant, which seems to be a very good proof text for saying, well, what covenant is that? Obviously, it's the main covenant, the one at Sinai, that all of you are standing actually here this day. But Nitzavim, especially as we get to the very end of Deuteronomy, really is not God speaking to the Israelites. It's Moses speaking to the Israelites. And Moses, both as is the mouthpiece of God, but also in terms of bringing up his own teachings, seems to be indicating here that as you all gather here, I just want you to remember, this is for you, but also for all the generations to come who are after you, who are not actually standing here. In which case, the text that he's referring to is not the covenant of Sinai, but the teachings that he's about to share in this particular moment in time. So, on one hand, while this proof text, because it refers to the people who do not stand here, could be used to refer to Sinai, I'm not sure that it actually works the best. But that idea that everyone was at that great moment of revelation is so embedded within Judaism. It's so embedded within the sense that the Torah is received and accepted by all Jews, no matter when it is that we live, that there may be another place in the Torah that it actually gives off that teaching. And that's what I'd like to offer you today from our Torah portion, Parashah Vaetchanan, which is immediately prior to the speaking of the Ten Commandments for the second time. That I think here's a more appropriate place to find that sense that every Jew, no matter when he or she lived, actually received the teaching from Mount Sinai. And for that, I want to go into the introduction that Moses gives before the reading, before sharing the Ten Commandments again. So here, go back for just a moment. We're at the beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 5. You'll see here, as I scroll down, verse 6, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, Asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avadim. I am the Lord thy God who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. That's the beginning of the Ten Commandments. So we have here this introduction. Verse 1, Vayikra Moshe el kol Yisrael, and Moses called to Israel, Vayomer alehem, and said to them, Shema Yisrael et hachukim ve'et hamishpatim. Hear, O Israel, the ordinances, the statutes, Asher anochi dover be'oznechem hayom, that I give to you in this moment, that your ears should hear from me. Ulamadetem otam, and that you shall learn them. Ushmartem la'asotam, and you shall guard them for the sake of actually doing them. So you're about to hear what those ordinances are, what those statutes are, and they refer specifically here to the Ten Commandments because that's what follows. But then there's also a way of introduction. We get Adonai Eloheinu karat imanu brit bechoreb, that the Lord God created a covenant, made a covenant with us in the place known as Horeb, Now, just as a very quick side note, there are two different strands of tradition in regards to the giving of the Ten Commandments. The first is we read in the book of Exodus, and the second we read in the book of Deuteronomy. In one of them, we read pretty much the same thing, except for the fact that the blessing for Shabbat, or the command for Shabbat, is Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'kodsho, that you shall honor Shabbat, that you shall remember Shabbat as a holy day. And then in the other one, we have Shamor et Yom HaShabbat, that you shall guard Shabbat, that you shall observe the laws of Shabbat. And this idea of Zachor and Shamor is very embedded within Jewish practice. For instance, one of the traditions to have candles on Shabbat is that idea of Zachor and Shamor. And in the Lachad Dodi, in the beautiful poem that we read, that we sing on Friday nights, it says Zachor v'Shamor, Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad, that this idea of guarding and of remembering Shabbat were said at once, as if to say that both examples of the Ten Commandments, that they actually happen at the same time, but that both ideas of remembering Shabbat, which has a lot to do with singing the songs of Shabbat, with remembering that this is a unique day, and so we have this joy, this special joy that comes with Shabbat, and that Shamor, the idea of guarding Shabbat, like it said in verse 1, that you shall guard Shabbat, or guard this day, in order to do it, to observe the different commandments, to observe the laws, which will help make this day a very unique day, that both of those ideas are combined into one. So Zachor and Shamor are very embedded within Judaism, but they come from these two different traditions of the Ten Commandments. And one of the ways in which you could see these traditions are actually in the names of the mountains that are used as the places in which the Ten Commandments are given. Notice I said places. In the book of Exodus, you have Mount Sinai, Har Sinai. But here, as we just read in verse 2, we have Horeb, or Mount Horeb. Now, those two places obviously are different because they're different names, but at the same time, in Jewish tradition, they're seen as the same place, just referred to in these two different ways. So Horeb, for the Jewish imagination, is the same place as Sinai, although it has a different name. And from a biblical critical perspective, it references the fact that there probably were these two different strains of tradition as to where the Ten Commandments, where these seminal teachings were given to the Israelites, that they could have been in actually two different places. So regardless, what I wanted to share by that is that when we're talking about Horeb, that we shouldn't be confused that it's not talking about the giving of the Ten Commandments. It is, it just may be a different tradition of it. So we have here the sense that God made this covenant with us at Mount Horeb. Now the with us, karat imanu, makes sense in regards to the sense that he made it with the Israelites. However, if you take that literally, that God made it with us who were at Mount Horeb, it indicates that it seems to indicate that the us, the Imanu, refers to the ones who actually stood at Mount Horeb. However, all of those who stood at Mount Horeb were killed earlier, meaning that they were part of the generation that did not believe they'd be able to get into the land of Israel. They believed the spies, and as such, God said that they would be destroyed. And in fact, Moses seems to be speaking to the generation who lived after those who stood at Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, and is thus speaking to a generation who did not stand there. And this question is raised by Chaim ibn Attar, who is a commentator on the Torah, who wrote a commentary known as Ora Chaim, or the Light of Life. And he wrote it specifically on a different part of the next verse, which we're going to get to in a moment. But what's important is what begins with here, with all. All the people with whom God had made the original covenant were dead already, as they had died in the desert. Besides, many of the people who faced Moses at this time had not even been born at the time God concluded the original covenant with the Jewish people. While one could answer that Moses said applied to only part of the people, this would be a forced explanation. Besides, what news did Moses convey to people by telling him that they were all alive? Did they know this without having to be told? Meaning, it doesn't make sense that the people who were actually standing right before Moses in this moment in time were the same people who were standing at Mount Horeb. So who could these Imanu, who could Imanu really be referring to? Could they be referring to those people who stood back then, or to the people who are standing here now? And how would that relate to recognizing who is supposed to receive this covenant from Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb? So with that question in mind about who is this Imanu, turn back to our text. Lo et avotenu karat Adonai et habrit hazot. Not just with our ancestors did God make this brit. Not with our ancestors did God make this brit. Now, the phrase right here, lo et avotenu, seems to be saying God did not make this with our fathers, but according to the medieval commentator Abraham ibn Ezra, it's not really lo et avotenu, it's lo rak et avotenu. Not just with our ancestors did God make this brit. Now, we can understand this in a certain sense by thinking back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses brings them up a lot as, God, you made this covenant with them, so you should also make this covenant with us. But I wonder here if the sense of avotenu is not actually our forefathers, our big-time ancestors, the guys who built the shul, so to speak, but rather it's speaking to the generation who lived right prior to us, i.e., those individuals with who stood at Mount Sinai and seemingly received the Ten Commandments from God at that moment. Because you might think that these commandments, which were given to our ancestors who died, no longer reflect upon us. It's, I think it's very similar to the ideas that the teachings from one generation should no longer apply to the next generation because they live in a different time period. And yet we as a society, and also in many ways I think about our family structures and our religious structures, really believe strongly in the idea of passing of tradition, that what we receive from the prior generation, or what the prior generation receives, is very important to be able to pass down to the next generation. We shouldn't simply break. Yes, our experience of this new generation is important, but it's important to pass down traditions of the Torah, understanding where Judaism, what Jewish history is all about, understanding how the Holocaust has made a significant impact on Jewish identity throughout the ages, that even though we have not lived through those moments, they still have a meaningful impact upon us as if we lived through them as well, which goes back to the next part of the verse. So if we read it simply as not just for our ancestors, ki itanu, but rather that this breach should be for us. Anachnu, us again. Elefo hayom, those of us who are here, hayom, today. Kulanu chayim, all of us who live. Now, I would be just happy with this explanation, the idea that these two verses together indicate that the covenant that God made with the Israelites at Mount Sinai is not just with the generation who lived at Mount Sinai, but rather like verse 2 says, that it was made with us who are here now, not the ones who were back then. Meaning that verse 3 comes to help explain what it means by us. It is not just our ancestors who stood there, but it's also us. And then it goes into further explanation of who us is. One is Etanu, okay, that's us. Let me go back for a second. And then it repeats us in another way. Anachnu, that it is not just the idea of that it is us, but also that all of us, as the next part says, elefo, all of us who are here, meaning that all of us who find ourselves in this particular place and time should also be included in that particular covenant that God gave us at Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. So that you could say that us refers to the kind of the larger sense of all of us who are around, but rather particularly those of us who are here in this moment in time, which harkens back to the teaching we read a little bit earlier from Deuteronomy chapter 29, when Moses said that this teaching goes for all of you who are here and those who are not here. So it indicates here that it's referring to all the people who are here in this particular moment, past that generation who had died in the desert. And to further illustrate that, not just here in this place and time, in this actually physical place, but rather those who are here in this particular place and time, and hayom, at this day that we are able to receive it. So it seems that the extra verbiage in verse 3 is there to help us understand that in verse 2, or help us to understand that when it's saying all of us stood at Mount Sinai, yes, or Mount Horeb, yes, it's not just the previous generation, it's all of us who are here now in this moment in time standing before you, Moses, we also shall receive it. Okay. I think I can buy that. Then it adds this interesting line of kulanu chayim, all of us who live. That's where I want to get to a teaching from One second. I want to get to a teaching from Obadiah ben Jacob Sforno, who is another medieval rabbi who lived in Italy in the late 15th and early 16th century. He said something interesting to share about this particular phrase of kulanu chayim. Hayom kulanu chayim. Today, all of us who live. Thus you, with whom I make a covenant as you enter the land, take heed in the same way of the generations to come who do not stand at this covenant. They will uphold what you take upon yourself. They will uphold what you take upon yourself. This, I think, is an extremely important phrase and something to consider. Every generation that lives takes on a certain amount of responsibility that is both of their own choosing and also what has been passed down to them. There is in making those choices for each generation in its own particular place, we have to judge how much of our past, how much of our tradition, how much is received, our masoret, is something that we take upon ourselves, is something that is important in our lives and that we want to live out, and how much of our own individualized experience is something that also weighs upon us, that will be important for us to be able to make our own choices for, that is different than the previous generation. Just to give one example of what I mean by that, if you think about the teachings from the Holocaust in regards to what does it mean to Jewish identity, what does it mean to be a people who have been persecuted, that idea that we have not always been welcomed into the nations of the world, that God seemingly doesn't stop evil from happening, those are important messages for us to be able to receive. But I know people from the generations who lived during the Holocaust that they identify the Nazis so close to the German people that even today they would still not buy a German car or any kind of German machine or creation. However, in my generation, because I don't have that particular experience of living through the Holocaust, I don't feel any of that concern. I would have no problem buying something that is German made. Can't afford a Mercedes, but that's a different question. So the certain issues that have come through tradition will not be adhered to, but certain elements do. And what Sforno is seemingly indicating is that you must be careful here, because everything that you take on, that you make as a choice for yourself as a person, that those choices will be important in regards to what the next generation decides to keep, let alone what they decide to throw away. So in other words, whatever you decide to throw away, it means it will be that much harder for the next generations to keep. There's a very familiar trope in American Jewish circles about the idea that when the Jews first came to America, they wanted to assimilate, and they decided to observe less and less and less in terms of the law, in terms of what Judaism is trying, in terms of being an observant Jew. And that trope seems to follow suit with this idea that because each generation observes a little bit less than the prior generation, that the following generations will observe a little bit less, and therefore that it will continue ad infinitum until there's no one observing anything whatsoever. And that we as generations have to know that the choices that we make may make it more difficult for future generations to observe things that we decided to discard. At the same time, though, the idea of kulanu chayim, of all of us who live, I think indicates that in this moment that I choose as a person who lives in this particular day and place, po hayom, this particular area of the world, this particular time of 2015, although I make a choice because of the fact that I'm living here, I know at this moment that even in making my own choice, there exist these stars, there exist these spirits of all the generations to come, which means at the same time, just as it is important for me, like Sforno says, to uphold tradition so that it's passed down to the next generation, so too doesn't mean that the future generations are also present in this moment as I experience having to make the choice. That is to say, when tradition says all Jews stood at Mount Sinai, that it is as if, despite the changes, despite what are the previous generations passed down and did not pass down, we still have that legacy of all being alive, of all being present in that moment of Sinai, so that it is part of what it is that we could choose. Meaning, for the Israelites who are living at the time of Moses, Moses is saying to you, you are not the only ones who are receiving this tradition. All of those who live will also receive this tradition. And I would say, maybe even against what Sforno says, even if you decide yourselves to not choose this, the people come after you could potentially do so. And to be aware of that, to be conscious of the fact that future generations will be able to make their own choices, both based upon what you choose and despite what you choose, which I think should give us more freedom to be able to make choices that are right for us, but more fear or respect for the tradition to know that it is so powerful that it will outlive even our own choices. And that we should be cognizant of thinking about its power in deciding how we want to make tradition relevant in our own lives. So did we all stand at Sinai? I think, yeah. I don't think we were there physically. I don't think that we have any recollection of it. But in the very fact that tomorrow we'll be reading what was said at Mount Sinai, that is a moment in which Sinai appears today. With that, I hope you enjoyed this week's class. Take care and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.